Great. Welcome to the Seattle Code Crafters Meetup. We are a diverse group of software professionals who are really passionate about finding and continuing to grow great ways of making software and continuously learning better ways of producing, sharing, and learning from each other. We are a language agnostic group. And while we don't necessarily always meet about a certain technology or language, we rather meet about a way to get better at writing code. Everyone's welcome, and we appreciate everybody being here. Today, Micheal Lloyd is going to talk to us about dysfunction mapping. And I ran into Micheal this year when I was in Manchester, England, at Agile Manchester, and really enjoyed the talk that he gave. And so that's why I asked him to be here. Micheal is the founder and owner of Honest Agile. And are you based in Manchester, Micheal?
I am, yeah.
Fabulous. So next time we all get over there, we'll go to his house for a barbecue or something. Yeah.
As long as you don't mind the two very loud dogs, yeah.
That is just fine. Just fine. So Michael's asked if we put questions and comments in the chat, and then we'll address them more towards the end. And go ahead and take it away there, Micheal.
Real, thank you. All right, I'm going to start by trying to share this window. Hopefully that pops up for everyone.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Let's move some stuff around. Cool. Yeah. So hey everyone. Thank you for the intro page. You've already got the basics on Mike. As you probably can tell from the name of my company, I'm an Agile guy. So I've got a background in business analysis, but for the better part of the last kind of 10 years, I've been mostly kind of Agile coaching, Scrum mastering, particularly with a focus on like real practical delivery, how to help teams and organizations get better at building stuff and delivering value. And that's kind of what I want to talk a bunch about today. I guess I can probably just jump straight into it because my first slide is always one that raises eyebrows. I don't know. Can everyone see that one? Let's see. It's always a great way to gauge the feeling of the group when I can see how they react to this one. Yeah. Yeah. It's, as you can probably tell by the framing of this, I don't necessarily think Agile is dead, but I think it's interesting that this conversation keeps coming up. And I spend an awful lot of time on LinkedIn, so you may not all be seeing it as much as I do. But it does feel like this conversation is happening a lot lately, right? And in my view, this is a symptom of something. I don't necessarily agree that Agile is dead, but the fact that a lot of people are talking about it and the fact this conversation keeps coming up tells me that there is something, bubbling under the surface that as a kind of product and delivery community, we might need to resolve. So I don't know how much we would all necessarily agree even on what Agile is and what that means. But when I think about Agile and this idea of delivering in small cycles, small batches, getting feedback quickly and adjusting, that seems to me like something that is essentially a given now, right? We've learned from experience that is generally a better way of doing things. And so the question is, why is the word Agile perhaps starting to become a bit of a poison chalice? And so I started doing some digging when I was trying to answer that question of myself, like, why is it that people are saying this? And there's a few things that kind of bubble to the surface. One of those is the layoffs, right? So I'm sure you've all been seeing this. It's all over the news. It's everywhere, right? Layoffs are everywhere. It feels as though this is a much bigger concern now than it was in the last year or two. And to put a bit of context to that, in just the 30 minutes that I kind of go through these slides, another 16 or so people are going to be laid off somewhere in the tech industry, which is quite a lot. And I don't have necessarily any data to back this up, but it feels like a lot of the layoffs are very much in the direction of Agile practices and Agile supporting roles. So I know Agile coaches and Scrum masters, which is what I tend to do, really seem to have been hit hard by this. But also a lot of sort of development coaches and people that are not hands-on doers are seeming to be affected a lot as well, which again, it tells us something about how the value proposition of those sorts of support roles maybe is starting to change. So either way, there's a lot of people suddenly facing this very real challenge, right? Of people are not seeing my role as valuable right now. why is that? What does that mean? What can we do about it, right? And when I went digging into this a little bit more, this is a number that really, really startled me because, Scrum Masters, whether you think that they're the best thing in the world or completely unnecessary, it's interesting that the average salary here in the UK, at least, has dropped by 10% in the last year, which tells me, the actual perceived value of those roles is lower, right? That's a fairly concrete piece of evidence that tells us that people don't see Scrum Masters as valuable this year as they did last year. And, again, why is that is a question that naturally follows. But this one here is actually the one that really, really struck me and is kind of what became the basis for this entire talk, really. The total listings for Scrum Master jobs, again, this is here in the UK, but it seems to be echoed elsewhere. The total number of new job master listings is much, much lower now than it was almost at any time in many years at least. So you can see there, looking at that graph, that we are a lower number of new Scrum Master job listings today than we were during the middle of COVID, which was a time of significant reduction in job listings. But not only that, if you trace it back, it's actually lower than any point since 2011. And like when you consider that the first full Scrum guide, as we now know it, didn't actually get published in 2000 until 2010, that really, really tells me something, right? So we've almost gone back to the beginning of when the Scrum Guide was created in terms of popularity and desire for Scrum Masters. Thanks, Paige, for doing the conversion for me in the chat there as well. In real money, 77.5 thousand apparently. So yeah, again, there's a lot of things that you could possibly pull from this data. I'm not necessarily here to draw any conclusions, but the thing that this definitely tells me is that general perception of people in supporting agile Scrum-like roles, that value proposition is maybe on the way down. And I know a lot of you all are probably thinking, well, I'm not a Scrum Master, so why do I care, right? But the thing I would at least suggest thinking about is Scrum Masters are kind of seen as the vanguard of the Agile movement, right? A lot of the times what happens to them is going to happen to the rest of the Agile movement to some degree, because if we don't see Scrum Masters as useful, probably that's a sign that we're not seeing Scrum as useful. And again, that has knock on to non-Scrum Agile related concepts. Steve has said, what about DevOps? That could be a whole conversation on its own. I can tell you that I recently worked in an organization that had a DevOps team that was responsible for batching up and doing all the releases every 3 months. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there as well. And that kind of goes to my point, right? I don't want to spoil it because I'm going to ask you all in a sec, but it's clear there's a lot of stuff that we're maybe not getting right. And as a result, people are maybe seeing some of the practices that we would like to be doing properly as not valuable because they're not being done in a certain way, right? And not adding value. But again, I don't want to kind of skew you too much from my thoughts. I'd love to kind of hear what you all think first. So I've just got a question here that you can kind of think about and throw some thoughts into the chat. Why do you think that perceived value of agile practices, and I use that in a really broad sense, right? We could be talking about Scrum, we could just be talking about agile as a general concept. We could even bundle DevOps into that. Again, I'm really just talking about maybe future-looking, new ways of working. Why is that stuff maybe less popular now than it was a few years ago? Too many useless certifications. First thing that goes in there. Very glad to see that answer. Yes, chuck some thoughts in. I'd love to know what you all think. Feel free to just shout out as well, actually, if you prefer, because we've got a small group today, right? So
I'm going to kind of echo some sentiments that I heard Uncle Bob say once, which is it's become a tool for project managers rather than developers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very big one. See a couple of really interesting thoughts there. So agile practice being pushed via command and control. Too many people poisoned by snake oil agile. God, that one is too real. Yeah, agile being synonymous with Scrum, right? Like I'm going to talk about Scrum a reasonable amount today, but for those who know me will know that I'm not a Scrum evangelist. I think it's a good way to get started for a lot of teams. I also cannot stand the way that a lot of people use it as like the benchmark for proper agile. I think that's ridiculous. Yeah, capitalization of agile coaching without focusing on outputs. We were just talking about that actually before the call kicked off. It annoys me how many so-called agile coaches just have no connection with the actual delivery of working products, right? Super frustrating. Agile industrial complex for sure. I call Scrum the Norton antivirus of Agile. I like that. We might have to talk about that one at the end. Yeah, XP delivers value, Scrum does not. It's funny because this is something I've talked about a few times, that I feel like XP has done a lot of the heavy lifting for Scrum for years without most, even Scrum Masters, knowing it. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about some of that later. Yeah, Agile is hard is another really good answer. So yeah, again, like feel free to keep adding thoughts there. I don't want to stop that conversation in the chat, but this is why I asked this question, because it's clear, regardless of what conclusion we draw, that there is some stuff going on in the industry that's having an impact on that perception of Agile as a concept, whether it's based on fact or not, whether it's true, whether it's just misunderstanding of what Agile is. There's something there that we need to address as a community, I would say. And I think this goes beyond just people like me, like Agile coaches. I think this is something that anyone that's building products probably should care about, because it feels to me there's a risk of us slipping back to old phase gate big upfront design delivery, which most of us probably have experienced at some point and know is maybe not where we want to go back to. So what do we do about that? Well, like I say, I kind of had some thoughts about even why this happened, and I just want to quickly run through some of those, because I think this is something that someone mentioned in the chat that really, really resonates with me. There is a major problem in the Agile world with this over focus on entry-level training, like 2-day workshops, learn a framework, off you go, do the stuff. And one way that you can kind of see that that's happening, I find, is with these PSM certifications, right? So professional Scrum management, God, that was a slip of the tongue, wasn't it? Professional Scrum Master, I should say. PSM1, which is the 2-day course, 600,000 people have got that, right? So there's a lot of people that have gone out of their way to get a 2-day Scrum certification. And when you look at the numbers of people that have gone up to get the PSM2 level certification, which is the kind of intermediate one, that drops off to about 40,000 people. So that's less than 1% of that total number. And then PSM3, which is the highest level, expert level Scrum, you really, really need to know how Scrum works. That's only about 1,400 people. And so that's 0.01%. 0.01% of the total number of PSM holders that actually go to that third level. And again, I'm not saying this because I think everyone should be chasing PSM certifications. That's not at all relevant. But just the fact that, this Scrum community, the Scrum industry that is a big part of Agile, for better or for worse, is just so over-focused on that entry-level stuff and not the high-level stuff. It says something to me, right? That tells me that there's a problem here somewhere. And in particular, when you think about the fact that another 100,000 Scrum Masters are likely to be minted in the next year at that PSM1 level, we're still focusing on creating new entry-level practitioners, not helping the existing practitioners to become real experts. Yeah, and George has said in the chat, right, it's a fair point, but it's hard to justify when employers don't value it. And that's a really good point. That's something we're going to talk about a little bit. Essentially, the problem there is, as an industry, we've accepted this idea that all you need to be a Scrum Master is to go to a 2-day course, which frankly, I think is just ridiculous, right? And maybe we can talk about that more at the end. And when we kind of look at a little bit further, another thing that I think is a big contributing factor to this value decline is the framework wars. It's this whole thing of, are we doing Kanban? Are we doing SAFe? Are we doing less? Everyone's always arguing about a framework. And, personally, I don't care. I've never met any really competent Agile, experts who really help with delivery that are wedded to a single framework. The only ones that seem to be wedded to a single framework, in my experience, are not particularly good at it. And really, the only question that matters, in my view, is, do you get results, right? Regardless of the framework, regardless of what you hybridize or not, do you get results? And that's kind of the third problem, right? Actually, don't answer that question is the way it sometimes feels, because when I ask people, how do you know that you're an effective Agile practitioner? How do you know, as a Scrum Master or a coach, that you have actually made a positive impact? You've fulfilled your value proposition. The answer that I often get is, it's basically one step above just trust me, bro, right? It's, well, the team feels a bit happier and, things are nicer, and it's nothing concrete, which is a real problem. It's not to say that everything can be perfectly boiled down to pretty pictures and dashboards. But we should be able to measure stuff, right? If something has changed, we should be able to point to something and say, this is how it's changed. This is how we know it's changed. And therefore we can talk about that. which again, something I find is very, very missing with a lot of Scrum and Agile practitioners. So leading to my perhaps most incendiary slide of all time. This is one that, again, always likes to raise eyebrows. It is easy when you look at all that stuff I've just mentioned to conclude, there you go. It's easy to look at all that stuff and conclude that the average Scrum Master is not competent. And I can certainly tell you that as a person who has hired Scrum Masters, has filled Scrum Master positions in the past, 9 out of 10 that I talk to don't seem to have a basic grasp even of the content of the Scrum Guide, let alone how to put that into practice and then demonstrate real measurable results, which is interesting. Again, it tells us something. And the thing I want to be clear about, right, is I'm not necessarily even trying to blame the individual Scrum Masters. I think people like me, coaches and trainers who are responsible for creating good Agile practitioners, have really dropped the ball with this 2-day certification treadmill, with the focus on frameworks. We have failed people, and we've created a bunch of practitioners that just don't know how to actually make things better for their teams, right? Again, I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus. My point here is just, given all this stuff that is, I would say, fairly hard to argue against, where do we go from here? What do we do to make things maybe a little bit better? Paige is saying, I'm not sure why this is incendiary. Yeah, to be fair, when I did it at Scrum Master Day, it got me in a little bit more trouble, but cool. So as you can probably guess, that's sort of what I'm here to talk about, right? So dysfunction mapping as an approach, as a tool, is my little attempt to try and move the needle against some of this stuff that we've been talking about. It is not a silver bullet, and I'm going to talk a lot as we go about, being critical, using your own approach. I don't want to be a person here that's just got another bit of snake oil to sell someone, right? Like, this is me essentially looking at all the mistakes that I've made over the last 10 years as a coach, seeing other people repeating those same mistakes, seeing all this focus on teaching people how to follow the Scrum rules, and saying, okay, maybe instead I could take my process, my patterns that I've developed for actually solving problems, and show people how I do it, in the hope that they can either avoid some of the pitfalls that I've made, or maybe tweak it and add their own approach to this. Yeah, I can see George making some good comments there about we don't spend enough time learning how to use and explain data. That's something that's definitely going to come up a little bit later on. So yeah, essentially dysfunction mapping, as you can basically see, it is not magic. It's stickies on a whiteboard. It's just a way of organizing thoughts, making stuff transparent, and ultimately building experiments for change. I'm going to talk through all that in a sec. But at its core, it's about the OODA loop, right? It's about observe, orient, decide, act. Figure out what's going on, make a decision, do something, and then start again from the beginning. Just to confuse people, it actually does start on the right-hand side with symptom, and then it flows over to the left. And we'll see if I get a question about that at the end. I won't explain why just yet. But essentially, this leads to this other question that I wanted to talk about, and which will lead into explanation, let's say, of dysfunction mapping. So the question is, what are some of the challenges to either creating or sustaining change as an Agile practitioner, as a developer, as a coach, leader, whatever your position is, right? And change is such a big part of what we do. What are the things that you find often get in the way of creating or sustaining that change? Again, feel free to just throw some stuff in the chat or to shout it out.
I think the biggest one, is change of leadership, because you can have a champion for Agile transformations, or Agile, for having agility within your organization, and then the moment that champion leaves, somebody comes along that replaces it with their entirely new idea of.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I know for like my experience, on 2 different occasions, I've been in an organization as a coach or a scrum master, whatever it is, and felt really proud of actually moving the needle and making things better. And then a new CEO comes in, just basically rips everything out from the root and sets everything back to square one again. And it's like, what do you do in that situation, right? It's really, really hard. Feel free if anyone else wants to shout out. I can see some good comments in the chat as well. Yeah, so I can see people saying culture and rewards, leadership, too much focus on delivery. We don't ever actually take time. I'm going to mention that a little bit later. lack of understanding of Agile and systems thinking. That's a really, really big one that I'm going to talk about a little bit. Incentives, resistance on many levels. Yeah, there's loads of stuff. Again, feel free to keep adding stuff in the chat, because we're going to basically talk about this now as we go, because I've now done workshops on dysfunction mapping for about 300 people. I've done meetups with a few hundred more. I've done talks. I'm not trying to brag here. I'm trying to say I've asked this question in some form to well over 1,000 people at this point, and I always try to keep a track of what I'm hearing and seeing. And the thing that's really interesting to me is I keep hearing the same things over and over and over again, right? The when you ask someone, what is it that makes this hard? It's management, it's incentives, it's all this other stuff. And again, this is something that I've tried to build into the approach to try to account for some of this stuff. And in particular, what I've tried to do is simplify it down to kind of 6 key areas that I find keep coming, back to the surface in this discussion. And they're these things that I've started describing as the 6 killers of change. So you can see them on screen. I won't read through them, but as you can probably see, these kind of summarize some of the things that you mentioned in the chat, and I'm sure they represent things you've all experienced at some point. What I essentially want to do is talk about how dysfunction mapping as a tool is built to help you solve some of these problems, to create that sustainable change, and in particular, how at each point it sort of tries to address, or at least give you a little bit of support in getting past one of these killers of change, trying to maybe make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to start then with low trust, right? So I always think about low trust essentially as being like a little devil that sits on people's shoulder that says, you can't listen to that person, you can't trust him, he's just trying to manipulate you, he's just trying to trick you, right? For managers, this is often the devil on their shoulder that says, oh, he just wants to slack off and get paid for doing nothing, right? And it's the voice in the head that is usually a learned behavior, right? This is what happens when you have had someone in the past that has slacked off and not done the work. It's what happens when you've had a scrum master that has been incompetent. If you have a framework installer that's tried to just make the company agile by making it do safe, right? This means that you've gone through something that has had a really bad outcome, and now you've developed this defensive shell. You don't trust people around you. In particular, when I think about Scrum and Agile and how many people have had really bad experiences with change agents that are just not particularly effective, well, it's no wonder to me that some of that trust is missing, right? And so you have to ask, what do you do to try to get past that trust barrier? Which is why for dysfunction mapping, the way that I start, the way this kind of whole process is anchored, is you start by doing this thing I call forming a funnel, which is going to be no different to probably what you already do today when you're trying to solve problems. It's look around, talk to people, walk the Gemba, right? Go to where the work is. Ask people the question, what is it that makes your life difficult? What are the problems that you care about? And the really, really important part of this that I'm really trying to break, to hammer into, particularly Scrum Masters, is you are not here to implement a framework. You're not here to tell people how to do stuff or how to do their jobs. You're here to get a sense of what is it that's getting in their way, right? What are the problems that they care about? And then use that information to hopefully help create minor incremental changes that address some of those things. So that's what we're doing here, right? I'm just essentially trying to anchor people to what are the things that people care about? What are the problems that they're trying to solve? And by listening, by actually asking that question and noting those things down and anchoring your actions to the problems that people care about, that starts to build trust, because you're no longer seen as, oh, this is the person that's coming in here telling me how to do stuff. It's, this is the person that's listening to my problems and eventually, hopefully, doing something about it. So we hopefully can get a little bit forward in that trust department. So even that is something I found as I've started running the workshops in particular. A lot of the stuff that I describe that seems obvious to me can be quite challenging to people that haven't been doing this for as long as I have. And I talk about, capturing things on stickies and building a funnel. And still I get questions like, yeah, but can you give me some more guidance, right? Specifically, how do I do this? So as part of the bigger workshop that I run that I'll mention at the end, I've got these card decks that I use to kind of gamify some of the steps and allow you to do kind of workshops around some of it if it helps. And there's cards like the prompt cards, the red ones, that say, what is causing us pain? Which is just a question you could ask to your team, to your stakeholders, even just to yourself, right? To get some ideas starting to flow. There's the conversation cards, the orange ones that say the daily scrum is a waste of time. It's a really good example of something that I like to talk about as the non-judgmental problem, which is to say, I'm not going to argue as to whether the daily scrum is or is not a waste of time, whether we should or should not be having a daily scrum. But the very fact that someone's complaining about it is a thing that I should note down, and I should be considering that when I'm forming up a potential plan for an experiment or a change. And then finally, the observations is one that says work is pushed onto the team mid-sprint. And the observations are examples of things you might see as an expert practitioner that has seen, let's say, anti-patterns in the past, but that actually, if you just ask people questions, they might never mention to you. Because I've been in this situation, you probably have as well, right? Where you say to the team, oh, that manager just came and said, drop what you're doing, do this, and you did it. And they're like, well, yeah, why wouldn't we? That's just how we've always done it, right? And so some things, they're never going to get mentioned to you because people just expect them to happen. And so observations can be a key part as well. Yeah, George has got a really good question there. I don't think I can jump into it now, but I think we'll come back to that. Like I say, all I'm really trying to get to here is that we start by looking at the system, trying to get a sense of what's going on in the organization at a high level and noting stuff down so that we can use that to look for patterns later. And that's what we're going to get to in a sec. So that leads us to our next change killer, which is this thing I call lack of buy-in. Again, I know that came up in a few different forms in the chat. And lack of buy-in, in my experience, is essentially a variation of I have more important things to do, right? It's the thing that happens when I don't actually understand the value or the benefit to me of doing this thing. And often it's a result of people not just having a connection to that change. The phrase that I've heard that I really like is, we don't have time to mend the fence because I have to chase the cattle. It's like that, for me, perfectly captures that mindset, right? Of, oh, no, I couldn't possibly spend time on this improvement opportunity because I'm so busy with all this stuff that I've got to do. Well, maybe if we do the improvement opportunity, we'd be less busy with stuff, right? And if we connect those dots for people, maybe it's a bit easier for them to take that step. And that's kind of what we're doing in this first kind of formal step after we've built our funnel in dysfunction mapping. This is about trying to connect those dots. What I'm trying to do here is look through the funnel for patterns, for things that feel related, things that feel like they could be connected in some way. So here you can see I've pulled together low confidence in releases, team working on too many bugs, constantly going back and forth between dev and test. We're often showing work at our sprint reviews that gets rejected. I don't necessarily know what it is that connects those, but I can, my spidey sense goes a little bit when I see those and says, these feel related, right? These are a connected problem. And what we're really doing is just trying to create that group to start building that buy-in. Because if, for example, I thought these 5 things were completely unrelated and didn't have any desire to change things, once I realize actually these are all connected, maybe we could actually solve all these problems in one fell swoop. Now maybe I'm bought in a little bit more. Or it could be similarly when it's a team, right? Maybe 6 different people complained of 6 different problems and they all thought it just affected them. Now I can see that everyone in the team is being affected by it. Again, now I've got a little bit more of that buy-in for, oh, we have to do something about this. So again, it's just looking for patterns, pulling things together and using that to connect the dots for people. Which leads to next killer of change, habituation. This is kind of my favorite one, mostly just because I like the picture, to be honest. So I got AI created these pictures for me, and this one is what I like to imagine when you kind of start in a new day, in a new job, in brand new organization. Say you're joining a bank or whatever, and you walk in and you see this giant dinosaur just sat in the corner while everyone's typing away on their keyboards. And you would like ask someone, wouldn't you, what's with the giant dinosaur? And someone would just look at you puzzled and be like, what do you mean? That's Gerald. Gerald's always been here. What? Like there's not supposed to be a giant dinosaur. Well, but Gerald's always been there. Right? It's a bit dumb, but like that is certainly how I felt a lot of the time. And this is that problem of habituation, right? When something has been there long enough, we just get used to it and stop noticing it. We stop seeing the problem because maybe we don't even realize that every evening Gerald's been eating one of our co-workers. As long as we haven't seen it, it's out of mind, right? Which again ties into what we want to do with dysfunction mapping to try and beat this problem. So this is the step that's called dysfunction. It's kind of the key one. This is about identifying a practice or a principle or a value, something that's missing, something that we're not doing that we could be doing that we think might explain those symptoms that we're seeing. And really, this is just about kind of reminding the team of these practices that might exist. So you can see one here that says team has no definition of done. Maybe the team has been working for years and just forgot that they're a Scrum team, but they don't have a definition of done. Now, when we talk about it, they're like, oh yeah, actually that could explain why we always are, breaking stuff with our releases and raising bugs. So it gives us a way to break through that habituation and examine our practice and say, is there a tool or a practice out there that we've just been ignoring, something we can pull in? And the reason that we care in this case is because we think it will solve some of our problems, not just because Scrum says so, but we're actively trying to form an experiment that says this will step us in the right direction. And really, really importantly here, right, this is not about enforcing the rules of Scrum. This could equally be, let's try and experiment with TDD. It could equally be, let's set up a CI/CD pipeline, right? These are just things that we can pull in, and we're literally using the word dysfunction to just break through that habituation and say, hey, other teams do this and we don't. That could be why we're seeing these problems. We hypothesize that could be what causes these negative outcomes. And so this is an image you've probably seen in some form a few times. I don't particularly like this image, to be honest, but it's a good way of visualizing the point that I want to make here, which is I'm using Scrum in my examples just because it's really easy, because there's a Scrum guide. I can point to it and say, these are practices you all recognize. I don't actually care whether teams use Scrum or not. The point is, of all the practices and values and principles that exist in the wider product delivery world, anything can be pulled in as a lens of dysfunction. And the thing that makes it a dysfunction is we're not doing it and it's causing problems. That's the hypothesis, and that's the thing that we want to test. And we'll get later to how we test that. Also, though, if you do need help, like I said, I like cards because they can make this a bit more fun in workshops. So one of my card decks is the Scrum Dysfunction deck. And it turns out if you're like me and you've got no life and you spend an entire evening just sat reading through the Scrum guide and write down every one of its practices as a potential dysfunction, you end up with 88 cards. And I mention that because 88 cards from a 13-page guide hopefully gives some illustration of just how much there is out there that we could potentially be pulling from, right? So again, it doesn't matter what you pull from. It's just about identifying potentially useful supporting practices. So leads us to the next one of our change killers, lack of direction. This came up in a bunch of ways. Often this is where that leadership problem kind of turns its head as well, because that's one of the things we kind of want our leaders to do, is help us understand the direction we need to go. And really important distinction on that one, right, is direction is not about saying, hey, you must go that way. It's about making sure that everyone's united in understanding, oh, that's the direction we're heading. We're not all going to just go and run in different directions and break everything. Actually, we want to be over there. And so by articulating that clear direction, things get a lot easier. So in terms of dysfunction mapping and how I'm trying to kind of teach people to solve that problem to some degree, it's about this step that's called purpose. And this is explicitly the part where, as a team, as a group, whatever this collection of people is that's trying to solve these problems, we make sure that we align on purpose, not the practice, not the thing that we just discussed, right? Team has no definition of done. It would be really, really easy to just say, oh, well, Scrum says we should have a definition of done, so let's do it. But why do we care about that? Right? Maybe some people in the team think it's about putting quality first, maintaining minimum standards. Maybe some people think that it's about making sure that technical debt doesn't overwhelm us. We should have that conversation and make sure that, as well as agreeing on the thing that we're going to try, we've agreed on why we're doing it. Because so many times I see teams make this mistake that they think they're on the same page, we're doing the same thing, but we're just pulling in slightly different directions, and that comes to a head at some point in the future. The other thing, this is really important, particularly when I use this in the context of training Scrum Masters and Agile coaches. This is about making sure that that person knows why this practice exists, and they don't just fall into, oh, well, I'm a Scrum Master, so my job is to make people follow Scrum. It's like, no, I want to hit them with a rolled up newspaper or something. It's like, do better. If you can't help people understand why these things exist, you shouldn't be asking them to change, right? Take that time, understand it, and then shrink it down. I often call these things you can see here a purpose statement, and it's similar to a user story. I describe it as a placeholder for a conversation. It doesn't need to capture anything and everything that you might talk about, but it's meant to be there as a reminder of a conversation that you've had, and hopefully a prompt for ongoing conversations, just so that we're always aligned to that purpose. And like we say, that really helps us with that direction problem. Yeah, Matt said unifying narrative. That's a really great way to put it. Cool. So that then leads us to change fatigue. I've got 2 more of these to go, so hopefully we'll get plenty of time for questions. Change fatigue is again, in my experience, normally a result of people that have been forced through really big destructive change that has had really bad negative outcomes. So of course they're sick of it, right? They're tired of restructures, they're tired of new operating models. The absolute last thing that a person who's been through that wants to see is another person coming in and trying to tell them how to do their job. And I find that we often lack empathy, especially coaches like me, when we have these sorts of conversations. We just imagine, well, we have to just push past change fatigue. We have to, make people just want the thing that I want for some reason, which again is not going to be helpful. It's not going to take us where we want to be. So instead, the thing or my way of looking at this is, well, number one, it's how do we actually build the solution together? And that's part of what dysfunction mapping is trying to give you, is actually get people together. And rather than me saying, hey, I'm the Agile coach and here's a solution, it's right, we've agreed on this purpose. Now let's have a conversation about some small steps that we might take in the direction of that purpose, some experiments that we might run. You'll notice it says solution because I wanted it to be just a nice single word for each heading, but I really want to stress that it is solution hypothesis. It's something we think will drive us towards that purpose. And the other reason this matters, right, is because they are small steps. It's not boiling the ocean. It's not trying to solve everything at once. It's what is just a little thing that takes us a step in that direction. You can see some examples there, right, around the definition of done. Maybe we play a game, right? If they're a team that's open to that. I know games can be overused, so I never want to just always use that, but it's an option. Maybe it's facilitate a conversation, actually, because maybe we don't have the answer. Maybe it's just get a bunch of smart people in a room, say, this is the purpose we're trying to achieve. What can we do? And the one that I use quite a lot when I'm in the early stages of change and trying to get buy-in is just share a video on a concept with some people. Like, hey, let's all just watch this video in our own time and we'll get together in a couple of days and talk about it and see if it sparked any ideas, right? Notice how small those things are. And the point there is we're not asking people to move a mile, we're asking them to move an inch. It's just one little thing. And then based on what happens, we'll either take a step towards that purpose or we won't and we'll learn something and then we can take the next step. And it becomes a cycle. So one thing I hope that's starting to sort of form in your minds is this picture that I'm showing you of this kind of linear path is not really linear. It's just the first path of this ongoing cycle that you'll be a part of. So again, cards, you know how much I love this. My favorite of the card decks that I made is this solution deck. It's very Scrum flavored, this one, but I am working on others. How do you come up with a solution, right? Again, Scrum Masters that have been not doing this for long often say to me, like, what do you mean, like, just come up with a solution? It's like as if I know how to get 5 people in a room and come away with a concrete step, right? Cool. So gamify it a little bit. Draw a card at random, apply it to a purpose statement and say, does this spark an idea, right? Does the value of focus potentially help solve this problem? Does the pillar of transparency maybe give me a way of doing something? Does the idea of an expert specialist possibly get an idea in my head, right? And again, you can ignore these cards. These are not like a part of dysfunction mapping, so to speak. They're just a supporting structure, mainly for the workshop, but you can use them elsewhere. So that if you're struggling to come up with an idea, how do I take a step in that direction? You can just draw some cards at random and see what happens. Oh yeah, the facilitator stance. I could facilitate a conversation. Easy, right? What will usually happen is something that normally people struggle with. How do I come up with a solution? And they'll spend weeks trying to get it right. They'll draw a card and within 10 minutes, they'll have an idea. And if you do that 3 times, cool, now you've got 3 ideas. And you've got options you can take to the people around you and decide which one to go after, right? And rapidly come up with your experiments. Again, no right or wrong answers to any of this. It's just getting those creative juices flowing. Cool. So I know I've been waffling for a while. I'm on to the last one of these change killers, and then we'll get to questions. Insufficient evidence. This is the big one, right? This is kind of, we talked about this a lot at the beginning. This is something that just keeps on coming up and is a real passion challenge of mine, let's say. How do we measure these changes? And as coaches, as scrum masters, as people who indirectly support those sorts of changes, it can be really hard to figure out what to measure, how to measure it. And in particular, I know that if you ask 10 Agile coaches, what are some good measures of Agile success or change, you will get 20 different answers. Thankfully, I think we're starting to get to the point where velocity is being seen as the bad answer. So, maybe we're making progress, but we're certainly not going to agree. And it's kind of good, right? Like, I'm glad we don't agree, because the idea of there being one correct metric for all situations just doesn't make sense for this kind of complex work. So that means that we have to be able to figure out how to measure the right things for the particular thing that we're trying to do. Yeah, George has just said we often measure what's easy, not what's important. I think that perfectly captures it, right? Vanity metrics, we always fall into that trap. So, okay, how do we get past that? Well, this is kind of where the magic of dysfunction mapping comes in. Maybe sounds a bit big-headed, but hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. What I've tried to do with this approach that you've now kind of worked backwards from the symptom on is make you do all of that hard thinking up front. Maybe make you tie things together in this systemic way so that when you get to that point of, okay, now I need to measure something, all you need to do is close the loop. You go back to the symptoms that you started with, and they potentially become your measures, right? Because these were the problems that people cared about. These were the things that we observed, that were reported. They can be empirically gathered. Now I just need to see, when I take this action, does it have an impact on those symptoms? And so something that's normally one of the hardest parts of these sorts of change plans, which is figuring out what to measure, actually becomes quite easy when you go through it in this kind of really deliberate and structured way. So again, it's, have I had an impact against the things that matter? Does my team actually feel better about those problems that were reported? Does the organization see a reduction against those issues that kind of kicked off the conversation? So that's the what, right? The what we measure is the symptoms, which is now made a bit easy, but the how can still be quite difficult, I find. And as you can probably guess, I've got another card deck for that. Because again, I realize there's a bunch of stuff that I've learned over the years, ways of measuring things that a lot of people who are newer to this just don't think of or know of. And in particular, the trap I often see people falling into is thinking, well, in order to measure something, I have to have a fancy Jira dashboard that's going to pull out all this exact data and present it in a way where I can manipulate and move things around. And if I don't have that, well, then I'm not going to measure anything. And that to me is a big, big mistake, because it turns out, as I've learned from experience, 80% of the value often comes from 20% of the measuring accuracy, so to speak. And what I mean by that is, as long as you can, with a pen and paper, consistently see that something has changed over time in a similar direction, that's usually enough. And so you can do things like, surveys are a really easy one, but the daily checklist, this is one that I use all the time now because it just saves me so much time. I'm trying to get a team to focus on, limiting their work in progress, focusing on a single goal at a time. And so we're using sprint goals as a way to do that. And I might just start observing the daily scrum, just, off to the side, not interfering, with a pen and paper, and just checking, did anyone mention the sprint goal today? Monday? No. Tuesday? No. Wednesday? Oh yeah, they did. And then over time, if we're doing coaching and facilitation and things that are aiming to get the team thinking more about their single goal, I should expect to see that they talk a bit more frequently about that goal. And I should start to see more ticks than crosses, right? And again, it's not perfect. I can't, manipulate that data in any really strong way, but I can fairly consistently tell if I've had a directional impact against that problem. And the way this starts to become really powerful is, well, if you've actually got 4 or 5 symptoms that you're checking, and you've got a measure for all of them, if they all go in the same direction, well, now you can be really confident that we're actually having an impact. And then maybe if 1 or 2 of those things just don't move at all, well, now you've learned something. Maybe they're not related to this problem that I'm solving. Maybe I need to reassess and rejig my dysfunction map and figure out how things might be connected, I should say. So again, none of these this is not an exhaustive list. It's not meant to be perfect. These are just creative aids for if you're struggling to figure out how you might measure your hypothesis. And the really important thing about all this, right, what we've just done, we've connected this stuff, built a hypothesis that essentially says, here's an action I'm going to take. This is the reason I'm taking the action. Here's the problem I hope it solves. And here are the symptoms that I'm hoping will be affected. And specifically right there up front, we've got measures. Here's how I'm going to know if things are moving in the right direction, or maybe an early warning sign that they're not. And that's what the measures are for, right? We're not trying to measure vanity metrics, right? We're not trying to be like, hey, this green line went up, therefore I'm amazing. This is a way of testing the hypothesis. Was I correct that these things are related in the way that I thought they were? And if all of these things go in the direction I hope, probably means that I'm correct and I can move on to the next small step. And then over time, some of this starts to become really useful data about the impacts that we've had. But what we don't want to do, exactly as Steve has just said, be careful of Goodhart's law, right? These are not measures of success. They're just information points that we use to figure out, are we moving directionally in the right direction? Strange way to phrase that, but you know what I mean. And again, we drop them as soon as we are confident that things are moving in the right direction, and we rejig and we start again. This is a constantly moving target. This is just a way of better understanding the system. It's about broadening our picture of the system that we work in by running these experiments over and over again. Cool. Yeah, sorry, I am aware this is a very dense presentation, so we will try to make sure there's time for questions. So basically, that's just the bulk of it. The last thing I kind of want to leave you with on it is this is not about right or wrong. One thing I really, really want to be super clear about, because I mislead people sometimes when I've only got an hour. This image that I created for my website, you might see that the image on the left and right are slightly different. This is to represent the idea of using dysfunction mapping in a complex system, right? Which is to say, you might look at all these connected pieces of the puzzle and you might say, here's my symptom, here's my dysfunction. And with that information, you might put together a hypothesis that you can act upon that creates a meaningful outcome. And that's awesome. But you might just as easily, at the same system with the same people, connected dots in a different way. Oh, wow, my camera has just decided to absolutely lose its mind. There we go. Don't get an AI-powered camera, folks. So you could just as easily, like the image on the right, connect those dots in a different way, and you could still come up with an actual positive outcome that impacts things in the way that we wanted, right? That's the nature of complex systems. There isn't a right or wrong way to connect things. We're just trying to consider the whole system, zoom in on a part that we think we can affect, and then see what happens when we do it. And there's no right or wrong. It's just about going through that process at regular intervals. I bet that was related to CrowdStrike. The last thing I add, just because I always find this is really valuable for people, is especially if you are a person that hires or works with Agile coaches or Scrum Masters who traditionally are not very good at demonstrating their value, what you can do is take those hypotheses, condense them down into coaching Kanban cards, as I call them, and put them on a visual board. Limit work in progress. Actually keep track of the things that you're doing, and dare I say it, do the stuff that we preach, right? And in particular as well, keep a record of the stuff that you've done so that if it did have an impact, and I like to keep these on hand for things like job interviews and performance reviews, right? Give me an example of a time when, oh, cool, I can just pull this thing off my dysfunction map board and here's what I did, here's why, here's how it had an impact. Brilliant. My image is broken. So this was meant to be back to the 3 problems at the beginning, the training, the framework wars, those 3 issues. I'm basically just trying to say that this is my little way of having an impact against those issues, right? I'm trying to give people a way to take the theory that they learn in the classroom and actually put it into practice and learn how to become better practitioners by really doing it and seeing what happens when they put it into practice. Trying to keep it framework agnostic, and of course trying to give people a way to show and demonstrate their value. So it is absolutely not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it might help you to more quickly and easily get to those testable hypotheses and hopefully a bit of data to back things up. I don't know why all of my images have suddenly broken. So there's supposed to be an image here of the 6 killers of change again. I'm going to just try, give me a sec, guys. F5 on my Canva app. No, I cannot. Weird. Okay, I don't know what's going on. You'll have to just take my word for it. I'll tell you what the pictures are. 6 killers of change, right? So even if this thing doesn't help you with all those other problems I mentioned, my hope is it at least gives you a little bit of a path to beat some of those killers of change. Yeah, CDN just blue screened. Oh, there we go. That image is sort of working. The QR code is gone, but other than that, we're fine. So if this sounds interesting to you, right, I do run workshops on this on a regular basis. In fact, I've got a leadership version of this workshop that I'm running just next week, which is all about taking it away from the Agile framing and actually talking about leadership and culture. How can you nudge the culture of your organization in the right direction through targeted experiments? But there's also a practitioner workshop that's the Agile flavored one. And again, in that workshop, we kind of break it down, do the activities, use liberating structures, build a real dysfunction map in a team using all those cards and kind of learn by doing. If that's something that interests you, please reach out. Right? I do those publicly and privately. but I don't like doing the sales pitchy stuff. So I try to make sure there's a lot of free content out there as well. So you can follow me on YouTube, Honest Agile, or if you are a Miro user, you can check out the Miroverse, search for Dysfunction Mapping. And there is actually a complete workshop template, including digital copies of all those cards, free of charge, that you can just give this a go and see how you get on. And if you do that, I would love to hear from you and let me know, how it goes. So the last frame I've got here is just a little quote from one of my personal favorite books. I don't know if anyone's read Turn the Ship Around. I feel like it's a fairly popular one these days, thankfully. I did do a leadership workshop the other day when no one had heard of it, which was a bit of a warning sign, But yeah, so this quote, one of the things that limits our learning is the belief that we already know something. This is kind of what I'm trying to bake in with dysfunction mapping. I'm trying to sort of give people this concept that, it's really easy in a complex system to not really fully understand what's going on, to optimize the wrong thing, to just take a wrong turn, right? And so what we have to do is act empirically with our work, which is observe, figure out what we think is going on, make a hypothesis, and then test it empirically, see what happens, and then try again, take those learnings and run through. So this is certainly not the only way of doing that, right? Dysfunction mapping is just a tool that, I built to help me, that I now teach to others. I encourage you to give it a try, use your own critical thought and tweak it for your context, or to just use your own method if you've already got a method of doing this that works for you. As long as we are doing that kind of empirical change, that's what I'm hoping to see, right? Whether people use dysfunction mapping or not. So that is basically it. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I would love to take any questions, or we can go through the chat for the stuff that came up as we went.
Yeah, fabulous stuff. Thank you. What do we have
Thank
for
you.
questions? I know there was several that came up in the chat early. Anybody want to bring those up or rehash those? Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
Todd, maybe.
I'll ask one. Thanks. Love having a definition of done. I've seen teams where they don't have that, and you end up with just random deliveries. And then when the conversation starts to create one, everybody throws in everything. And then the team doesn't feel like Agile. It feels like, let's create three-ring binders again. How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I think part of this does just come down to like the people who have seen it done well that are hopefully there to support you, right? So, I often rely on analogies for this stuff. Wow, my camera really doesn't like me today. Give me a sec. Right, I'm going to turn off the AI tracking, and I'm going to just let it sit on my face, and hopefully that sounded weird. Let it look at me and not do that again. Right, I apologize. Back to the question. So definition of done. I mean, for me, it's about the conversation, right? And I do always like to use the analogy, and the way I always describe it with teams is like thinking about running a restaurant, McDonald's or something equivalent, right? And you're trying to create a list of the things that you need to do before stuff comes out of the kitchen and goes to the customers. And it would be really easy to just write a massive list that says the burger should be cooked, you should put salt on the chips. And it's like, well, you clearly don't need to write down the stuff that's obvious. But maybe you should write down stuff like, oh, chicken should be at least 73 degrees Celsius before it goes out, or whatever that is in American figures. We should make sure that everything that was on the docket is on the tray before it goes out to the customer. It's about capturing the things that are likely to trip us up or have tripped us up. And in particular, that learning cycle of, well, anytime something goes wrong, that's a good candidate for making a change, for putting something on our definition of done. But what we don't want is a massive laundry list of anything and everything that we might need to do. In terms of dysfunction mapping, that's kind of part of what that purpose step is about. It's like, as a team, what are we actually trying to achieve? Have an exhaustive list of everything that prevents us ever making a mistake? Or are we trying to improve our quality by talking about the things that we know have been problematic for us before? And as long as you kind of start the conversation from that point, I find people usually will contribute. In particular, for the definition of done one, keeping it engineer-led or team-led is kind of the key there, right? So I find that things can get very dangerous when you start letting stakeholders and managers have too much of a say in definition of done. But again, that's all practice level stuff, right? And it's why I would throw it to, right, what does the team think we can do to kind of move in the right direction? I know that doesn't really answer the question, but I hope it kind of somewhat does. Feel I have to take a follow-up.
Yeah, and it's different in every environment. Every environment's dealing with different problems and different team personalities.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, which is why this all has to be collaborative, right? I think that's the main thing for me is how can a team together build a definition of done that makes sense for them in their context that they are happy with. If they can do that, it doesn't really matter what I think about it, right? If I'm not an actual contributor on that team. So any other questions? I always like to say I don't believe in the idea of there are no stupid questions. I believe that the stupid questions are the best questions. I always ask really dumb questions and find it creates really good conversations. So if anyone wants to ask a dumb question, please feel free. Or if you've got an insightful one, that's also fine.
So I have a question for you. Where do you think that your biggest inspiration for this, I'll call it a framework for now, where do you think your biggest inspiration for that came from?
So I think the point at which I decided to structure it and actually put it together the way I do, like I say, it was built over many years. Just as it started with me writing stuff down on my iPad of all things and just connecting things with lines. It got a bit more structure over time. The moment at which I decided to kind of put it together and share it, it was when I was learning about causal loop diagramming, which is a concept that I'm really, really fond of. I think it's a really, really useful tool. But I kept finding that it was very, very difficult to get people who weren't very familiar with the process already to understand the connections that I was drawing and what I was talking about. And I also found that it was really, really easy for me to trick myself into thinking I understood something more than I did. And so part of what I'm trying to do with dysfunction mapping is take the same basic concept and I describe it as linearizing the non-linear. So it's about basically zooming in on one little portion of a causal loop diagram and saying, right, this is what I'm actually thinking is going to happen and what I'm going to do about it. And now I know that it's not linear, so I can't trick myself into thinking I know everything, but I'm going to look at this little bit of the system and see what changes. So I think that's the main thing. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of seeped in over the years through osmosis. So there's no doubt a lot of much smarter people than I that really did the thinking that kind of goes into this. All I've tried to do is take the structure of it that's worked for me and share it with others. Any other questions?
I'll ask another. There's a pause. Did I step on someone? Sorry. Go ahead, Tammy.
Sorry. I was wondering if there might be a better word than dysfunction, given that you might want to go for improvement rather than sort of a target vision. It's not like we don't match the vision that that it should be. It's that we can see that things could be better.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, and I always get some form of that question, so I know it's something that a lot of people think about. And there's a couple of things really. So partly, what I want to make sure that I do is reinforce the idea that you don't have to practice this approach in the way that I did. If you're finding that there is a better framing, better language, better way to structure things, that's fine, right? And so in particular, if you're in an environment where the word dysfunction on its own can be a bit challenging, you might want to change that word. I did nearly change its name to purpose mapping early on, but I decided in the end that I wanted to stick with dysfunction mapping for a couple of reasons. And the main thing is I have found almost universally every time I've gotten into this with people in the workshops where we do it, and people talk about, well, I can't really do this because people will be upset by the insinuation that there is dysfunction. And it's like, cool, we've just identified our first dysfunction, right? The fact that we can't talk about dysfunction, we've already made progress. And I find that really, really powerful is the understanding that there is no such thing as a perfect system. Therefore, every system is dysfunctional. And as soon as we accept that, right? And in the workshop, I talk about this in more detail, right? But I really am just using that most basic dictionary definition of the word dysfunction, which is a system that is not functioning normally, right? Or as it's expected, right? If you've got liver dysfunction, it's not about blaming your liver for not doing what it's meant to do. It's, oh, hey, there's something bad happening here. How do we fix the liver? It's the same thing from a system perspective here. And you'll note, I don't like to talk about individuals as dysfunctions. This is about processes. This is about values, that kind of stuff. Learning happens when you're outside of your comfort zone. But the other thing, like I say, that the other reason I like to talk about it is basically just to get people into a little bit of a uncomfortable situation, right? Which is to say, if you're not ready to talk about dysfunction, maybe you're actually not even ready to be problem solving. Maybe you need to actually get into that kind of zone first. That said, there's a whole lot of my own personal bias and experience very deeply integrated with all of what I just said. So that's why I encourage you to use your own approach, right? And if you think that there is a better way to frame it or to word things, go right ahead, right? You don't have to do it the way I did. Does that answer, or any follow-up question on that, Tammy?
So who do you typically have these conversations with about these different, I know you mentioned for the funneling that you're talking to stakeholders, you're talking to team members, you're walking the line, obviously, but like when you've identified the symptoms and the dysfunctions and you want to articulate the purpose of the solution that you're proposing, where do you find the most impactful place to have those discussions?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I find really varies depending on the kind of organization you're in. And actually, I created a little quadrant a while ago to kind of visualize this for people based on my experience. And you can imagine a quadrant that's got autonomy on one axis and psychological safety on the other. And so if you're in an organization that's where you've got high autonomy and high psychological safety, the answer to that question is everyone. Like, treat this as a full collaborative exercise and bring as many people in as often as possible. And in those sorts of organizations I've worked, essentially where we just like invite everyone, almost like it's a sprint review kind of situation, and just get together at regular intervals, and whoever turns up, we have that conversation with. If you're in the low autonomy and low psychological safety zone, that's the what we would call in the UK the bum covering space. That's, you need to protect yourself. You need to, accept the reality that you probably can't have open conversations about dysfunction with the people around you, and so you want to find and pair up with a few people that can be you can trust, that kind of there with you. You'll note that even in that scenario, the answer is not do it by yourself. I would say that's just a recipe for bias to sneak in. So it's always collaborative, but the degree of collaboration and who with kind of varies. And so, high autonomy, low psychological safety is as much of your team level practitioners as possible. High psychological safety but low autonomy is maybe, again, kind of trusted groups, but different kinds. It's an imperfect analogy, but I guess my point is, think about your context and who are the largest numbers of people you can collaborate with safely to have those conversations.
So basically, it depends.
Yeah, it is such a coach answer, isn't it? Yeah. The one thing I can say for sure is don't do it by yourself. That's the one that line I always draw is like, don't just think you can lock yourself in a room and just think through and come up with the right answers, because the more confident you are that they're the right answers, the more wrong they probably are. Cool. Anyone else? Thoughts? Anyone want to challenge or just disagree with anything I've said? Those are always fun.
I'm actually kind of curious about, you said in the beginning a lot of during the first couple slides when you're kind of calling out the Scrum certificates. What slide dropped the most jaws? Just out of curiosity.
So I think the average Scrum Master not being competent is the one that because I'm normally targeting. Sorry?
You get a lot of death stares in the room when you say that.
Well, to be fair, I usually try to make sure I've justified it quite well up until that point so people know where I'm going. I did one time post that slide without context on LinkedIn just because I'm a fire starter, and that caused a lot more upset. But yeah, I think for me, it's about not shying away from the realities of the problems that we're facing, right? And I think that gets me in trouble a lot, but I very strongly believe that most Scrum Masters aren't really Scrum Masters, right? They're project managers that have had 2 days of training, or they're sometimes they're grifters that have come from completely unrelated industries, know nothing about product development, and are now kind of acting like pseudo psychologist teachers. So there's a lot of really critical things I can say of what I would say is a small percentage of them. And then I think there's a much bigger percentage that are people that have just been badly trained and supported by that other small percentage of people. And yeah, that, like I said, this is why my whole thing with all of this, the thing I'm trying to do is say, hey, there is a better way of improving as a problem solver, as a change agent, and it's doing it right. It's actually solving problems and demonstrating the outcomes. It's not learn a bunch more theory. Because yeah, I love systems thinking. I love theory of constraints. You know, they're ideas that I'm passionate about, but theory alone is meaningless, right? You gotta put it into practice.
Yeah, I think what I like about this dysfunction mapping, like I've done similar things of like taking a team where they're at, and we start to do little experiments based on what we see. But I think about the formality of this is it kind of reminds me of like the 5 whys.
Yeah.
It's slightly different, but it's the same, like, I guess, problem in my brain where I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
what's the actual problem? Okay, what do we think that dysfunction actually is representing? I think that really works. All right, clicks with me. I really
Yeah.
enjoy it. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And yeah, it's something that I've encountered a few times. So when I share dysfunction mapping with big groups, what I usually find is a lot of people are like, wow, this is really cool and amazing. I'm going to use it immediately. And then a big chunk of people are like, this is what I already do. I don't know why. A lot of them even say to me, I don't know why I never thought to write it down like this before, because clearly it's, you know, potentially useful to some people. Again, that might be my ego just getting a bit big, but I think the point here really is we all have kind of built up these patterns for taking the theory and putting it into practice. And the bit that I think is really missing in our industry is people who are not interested in just trying to sell certifications, but are trying to teach people that practice. And so it's like giving them a way to get started. And like I say, I'm very, very insistent on, you don't have to do it my way. I just want you to think about things in that structured way, and then you can tweak it for yourself. So yeah, 5 whys to be fair as well, just to add to that. I'll have to see if I can dig it out, but someone sent me a link to a board that they created where they actually combined Fishbone Ishikawa diagram with a dysfunction map. And I thought that was a really cool thing. And that's the sort of thing I often encourage people to do as well, is like, I've deliberately tried to put the minimum amount of things in the dysfunction map to teach it to people. And there's a lot of stuff that I tend to do in the real world that isn't actually a part of the process I teach. So I would encourage other people to do the same, right? Is bring in other techniques and things that you think will support it and give that a go, see what happens. Oh yeah, 6 thinking hats is a really great idea, actually. I've never done
What
that.
I like about your framing of this, though, is that it's very visual, I think. And especially, I know you said you didn't want to talk about or maybe someone was going to bring up why we're going right to left, but I actually think that's very important. Because we're really focusing on what is it that we're actually trying to do. What's the current experiment that's going on? That's the most important thing on the board. And by making that visual in that way, I think that's really awesome. And I'm really excited to try this out.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And please do reach out if you put it into practice, if I can help with brainstorming or you know, be a sounding board. Yeah, and to that point, I usually just like to wait until the end and ask people to tell me why they think that the board goes from right to left. Because people normally can kind of figure it out once we've gone through it. But the short answer is basically what you said, right? The way I describe it is I'm trying to introduce a bit of deliberate friction to the first part of the process of creating the experiment, because that's not where you spend all your time. That's actually where you should spend the smallest amount of time, right? Most of your time is going and doing the stuff, running the experiment, observing, seeing what's changed. And so I want that first bit to be a bit harder. And then the next bit, which is where you're actually reading it back from left to right. Here's what we're observing. Here's what we're doing. That's right front and center. And so again, I say to people, if you want to flip it around, if you find it hard to work backwards, just change it. That's fine. But for the process, I want to make sure that people stop and think about it for a second.
So since you kind of brought up theory of constraints here, one thing that is a critical piece to me is the proposition that unless you are solving the biggest constraint, you're not solving anything, right? You're not actually fixing you can, the analogy is you've got a hose and you've got a blockage that has a pinhole in it. You can remove all the other blockages, you're still constrained to the pinhole. So, but then there's the balance here that I think is, okay, that's great in theory. Like, okay, so we try to identify the biggest dysfunction and we want to solve that. But then there's the other proposition of, but yeah, we need small steps. And trying to solve the biggest blocker is not a small step. So how do you kind of balance which one of those dysfunctions you kind of tackle. What's the prioritization? I guess that's a good question. What's the prioritization of the dysfunctions that we probably want to tackle?
Nice. Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question. And we dive into that in a bit more detail in the workshop, as you can imagine. But the basic way I try to frame it is often it's easy to think that we know what the biggest problem is, and we don't, right? And so we can't just go to, well, you must solve the biggest problem. That in itself is a question. And so part of what we do is that initial symptom building step, right, where we're connecting things that are related, is we're looking for, well, what's the biggest set of symptoms we can actually connect, right? Because if there's this thing where I've got 9 potentially related symptoms and down here I've only got 3 related symptoms, there's a good chance that that's pointing me towards what the biggest problem is. And so now I'm going to say, right, that's what I think the dysfunction is. And then to your point about the problem solving, it's, well, what I'm trying to do is identify the biggest problem, but then solve it in a series of small steps. And what will usually happen when you actually go through this process multiple times is that some of the symptoms will get hit really, really quickly and really, really hard, and they'll dissolve away. And so then that might actually force you to switch and look at a different problem. And the point is, as long as you're constantly reassessing and allowing that dysfunction map to shift based on what you learn and not treating it as just, okay, now I've got a static list of problems to solve, then once you've gone through it a few times, it starts to become very, very clear which thing is the big thing. Because it's like, no matter what we do, no matter what experiments we're running, this set of problems just keeps on rising to the top. Cool. That is almost certainly the thing that we now want to really, really focus on. And now it's going to be 5 to 10 iterations, maybe, of small steps to try and make an impact against those. Again, still, this is all very uncertain, right? I don't think it's really possible in most cases to actually know for sure that you're focusing on the right thing or solving the right problem. But it's just, to me, it's about that constant going through the loop of each time you get a little bit more confident.
So
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
When I think about a problem like this, and do you tackle the biggest thing, theory constraints, the biggest constraint, or do you tackle the small steps? I fall back on an example that a lot of us can relate to, is you've got a big, nasty 1,000-line method that you have to refactor. How do you refactor it? It's huge. There are so many things. You start with small baby steps. You start experimenting with little bits and pieces of the code, small steps, play with it, didn't work, revert back. Or, oh, that worked, that worked. And eventually, very much like you say, is things will become clear and easy and concise. And then I need to do this, this, and this. And boom, the big constraint is gone.
So this kind of ties into the idea of the low trust piece of this too, because if there is low trust in your ability to resolve these challenges for these teams, you have to be able to prove effectiveness in the changes that you're proposing. So that's why, and this goes back to, if you aren't solving the biggest challenge and you're not, and sure, that's great that you solved the definition of done, but we're still not releasing in any sort of timely manner according to whatever metrics they've come up with. So the point is, like, until we can tackle something that actually brings about a resolution that is acceptable, and then that ingratiates some level of trust now that we actually know what we're doing, then we can start to propose more changes to solve other problems. But if it's the biggest thing, and I think this is perhaps the biggest challenge when we're talking about early on, what's the biggest challenge of Agile adoption in general? It's very difficult to affect change if you can't fix the thing that is the biggest problem in the organization.
Yeah.
Quite often that is so institutionalized that you can't really tackle it. The challenge is so big that one person, or even a team of Agile coaches, is not going to come in there, because that one person that's a stalwart for this is the way we do things is too big of, they are the blocker, they are the thing, they are the pinhole in the hose. So how do you get that trust? How do you develop that trust? How do you do that if you're just baby steps maybe on the big thing? I think that's what we're kind of saying. I think Steve, this is kind of what you're saying, is it is the big thing, find the big thing, and then work on small steps towards the big things, and maybe not the other small little dysfunctions.
Yeah, and I think there's two things that you've sort of said exactly what I would say in a class, essentially, right? Which is I've always liked the phrase that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And part of what we're doing with dysfunction mapping is building a wrong model. Like, we know it's wrong; it's never going to be a correct model. And a joke that I often make in the classes is, if you think too much about what's the deeper next level root cause, right? If you do many 5 whys analyses, eventually you always get to, oh, I have to overthrow the government, because all paths lead back, to a certain point. And so there is always a balance between, well, yes, we want to, it's systems thinking, what's the biggest impediment, but what's the actual, what's the constraint that is actually within the boundaries of what I can control, that, like you say, that I can potentially demonstrate a real meaningful change against by, in this case, has a symptom actually been resolved? Are we releasing more frequently? Are we producing fewer bugs, right? These are the things that matter. And yeah, again, there's never going to be a perfect model. And that's why I stress so much in the classes that you have to think critically about this. You have to trust your spidey sense, which is something I talk about a lot. And sometimes you have to go with your spidey sense above what Mike tells you in the class, because I am not you. I don't know your context, right? But I think to your point, yeah, it's identify the big thing, make sure that you can get some small wins, demonstrate success, build the buy-in, and then the next bigger step becomes slightly easier. And I mean, I can give you an example of, I use this in an organization. I was there as a scrum master at the time. This was a few years ago now. And I was very unpopular when I started in that job, because I was very transparent about a lot of the dysfunction that I was seeing. By the time that my contract came up, I was there for 9 months in a contract. By the time the contract came up, my boss at the time asked me to go and put my dysfunction map in front of the CEO and the exec team to show them what I was doing. And as a result, they asked me to come on board as an agile practice lead and actually do some of the stuff. And the point was, I was able to actually say to him, yes, these are the ways that I've started making impacts against this, but now we need more. We need more buy-in. We need more support. We need more training, or whatever it is. And being able to actually say, I'm not just giving you a bunch of complaints about what's broken, I'm showing you the things that we've improved. It builds that trust, right? Which, again, always imperfect, always incomplete, but small steps.
To that extent, how do you track the changes that have been made, and so that you can show them as successes?
So that there's the bit I kind of alluded to at the end. So my way, and like I say, I don't actually teach this as part of the approach. I encourage people to think about their own way, but my way is to make sure that every time I've come up with like an experiment, a hypothesis, that it gets converted into a Kanban card. And this is part of, I'm actually channeling like Alistair Coburn here about understanding the different levels of granularity that people need in the organization. Because a lot of people, they don't want to see my whole dysfunction map or see the whole hypothesis and know everything. But what I do want is a placeholder, so I can say, yeah, right now I'm working on the definition of done problem. And then inside my little Kanban card, I'll have the details, and in particular, the things that I'm measuring. And I'll just note down. And oftentimes, like I say, it's very imprecise. It's once a week I'm going in there and saying, here's a summary of the data points that I've gathered. And I'll just spend 5 minutes writing some numbers in out of my written notes. And then after a month, if they've all trended in the right direction, cool, now I've got something I can share with people. If they've not all trended in the right direction, well, I'm not going to show people. I'm going to just rejig, come up with a new experiment and try something else, right? So it does become a little bit possible to game things, but as long as you keep that mindset of, I'm not trying to prove myself right, I'm trying to better understand the system. As a result, you will end up with good data that helps to prove that you were successful by not chasing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. I'm gonna stop the recording, and we can continue to discuss if we have more stuff. Next month, Amber Convo will be with us, and it's going to be great. She's a wonderful gal, and we're excited to have her. So thank you again, Michael. And do you have a website or something where we can?
Dysfunctionmapping.com is the easiest place. So you can find the links to the Miro boards and some articles and videos there. I'll be honest, I'm really rubbish at actually maintaining my website, so it's a bit mediocre, but it's got the links you need. And also you can find me on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me there too.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much.